I want to look at the ADHD and smoking example situation at the beginning of the 4.2 notes. But before we do that, I want to look at some definitions. First of all, what's the difference between an observational study and an experiment? In an observational study, individuals are merely observed and variables are measured, but there is no attempt to influence the responses of those being observed, of the individuals being observed. No treatments are imposed by the researcher. Whereas in an experiment, the researcher deliberately imposes some treatment on individuals in order to measure their responses. Variables are deliberately manipulated by the researcher. So let's take a look at what we call those variables. The variable that is manipulated in an experiment would be the explanatory variable. In an observational study, the explanatory variable would just be in a variable that is observed to see if there's an association with the response variable. The response variable is what we are looking to see, what we're looking at that variable to see what happens to it based on the explanatory variable. So now that we've got those definitions, let's take a look at the ADHD study. This study says that a mother smoking during pregnancy and exposure to lead significantly increases her child's risk for developing attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, say researchers. In fact, as many as 1/3 of cases of ADHD in children are linked to exposure to tobacco smoke and lead before birth, giving moms yet another reason to quit smoking during pregnancy. For the study, researchers from Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center surveyed over 4,700 children between the ages of 4 and 15 and their parents. Over 4% of the children included had ADHD. The researchers found that those children whose mothers smoked during pregnancy were over twice as likely to develop ADHD as children whose mothers had not smoked. Based on the study, should we conclude that smoking during pregnancy causes an increase in the likelihood that a child develops ADHD? And the key word here is causes. If you read page 235 in the text, there's a paragraph right in the middle of the page, not in a box, just in between a couple of highlighted boxes. And it talks about the difference between an experiment and an observational study and what you can conclude from one or the other. Bottom line is that cause and effect, evidence for cause and effect, can only be determined from an experiment. An experiment in which the researcher follows certain protocols, which we'll discuss later, and randomly assigns the subjects or the individuals in the experiment to various treatments and then measures the response based on those treatments. We can get evidence for cause and effect from an experiment, but not from an observational study. So it is very important to be able to distinguish one type of study from the other. So when we look at this, the question is, were any variables deliberately manipulated by the researcher? What variables do we have here? We have two potential explanatory variables, which are the lead level, or the exposure to lead, and the smoking. We have two potential, or we have a response variable, and the response variable is whether or not the child got has ADHD, so ADHD or not. The lead exposure and the smoking were not deliberately manipulated by the researcher. In fact, it would be highly unethical to do so. We couldn't say, let's expose your child, this pregnant woman, to lead, and let's make this pregnant woman smoke, and then the other ones don't have to, and let's see what happens to their child when they're born. That would be highly unethical. So this is an observational study. Because it's an observational study, we cannot give evidence for cause and effect. This is an observational study, cannot be used to determine, or to get evidence, I should say. You can't ever fully determine cause and effect, but you can get strong evidence from an experiment. Get evidence for cause and effect. Okay. Actually, a well-designed experiment does give evidence for cause and effect. Okay. for more explanation on confounding, I'd highly recommend the confounding tomato example video for an explanation of confounding. But we're going to talk about confounding in the context of this study. Confounding occurs when two variables are associated in such a way that their effects on a response variable cannot be distinguished from one another. So basically, when we have confounding, we have the explanatory variable seems to be associated with the response variable, and another variable also seems to be associated with the response variable, and the two variables are linked together in such a way that they cannot be separated. And that's the important thing. So when you are discussing confounding, you can't just say, these two variables are confounded, so the experiment's bad. You have to say how the two variables are associated with each other in a way that can't be separated, and how they both affect the response variable. So for example, let's just look at smoking. Smoking appears to affect whether or not a child has ADHD. Now, we can't determine cause and effect, but there seems to be an association anyway between smoking and ADHD. But what if smoking is actually a result? So this is just an example. What if the parent having ADHD actually influences them to smoke? So let's say a parent who has ADHD is restless, has trouble relaxing, maybe has to have something to do with their hands all the time because they're kind of hyperactive. So they tend to be, so people with ADHD tend to be smokers more often than people without ADHD. And of course, if a parent has ADHD, maybe there's some genetic connection to the child having ADHD. So this would be an example of confounding. I could link parent ADHD to smoking, and I could also link parent ADHD to child ADHD, and I wouldn't know if it was the smoking or the parent having ADHD that was really the main association here. So that would be an example of confounding. We could think of other things, like maybe people who smoke also tend to have unhealthy habits of lack of exercise or poor diet as well as smoking, or maybe they drink heavily, tend to drink more heavily than people who don't smoke, and maybe any of those things also could influence whether or not a child has ADHD. So those would be some other examples of potential confounding variables. Now, without doing some sort of test or some experiment, I don't know if any of that's true, but those are potential confounding variables. Is there any way to prove that smoking causes ADHD? Well, I just got through saying that we can't demonstrate cause and effect unless we have an experiment. So think about, how would we do an experiment for this? Would we say, take a group of volunteers, divide them into two random groups, and say one group has to smoke cigarettes for 25 years, one group has to smoke cigarettes, get pregnant, have a baby, and another group doesn't smoke cigarettes, get pregnant, have a baby, and then we look at how your child turns out. Obviously, that's ridiculous and unethical. So actually, there is no way to do an experiment to cause this. Now, that doesn't mean that down the road there might be some fairly certain evidence that smoking causes ADHD. In the 40s and 50s, cigarette smoking was very, very common. As a matter of fact, tobacco companies gave away cigarettes to the GIs in World War II. And people didn't know it was bad for your health at that point. But when they started, then cases of lung cancer started becoming common among smokers, and there was this concern that smoking causes lung cancer. There was no way to prove that smoking causes lung cancer because, once again, you couldn't do an experiment and say, hey, we'll make you smoke for a long time and you don't smoke and we'll see who gets lung cancer. As a matter of fact, the tobacco companies successfully argued in court that there really was no way to prove it. You could easily say that the association between lung cancer, and you could potentially say that the association between smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer was that people who had a genetic predisposition to develop lung cancer also craved cigarettes to soothe the irritation in their lungs, and therefore that's why they smoked. Maybe they had a genetic predisposition to crave tobacco in addition to their lung cancer. Now we look back and think that's ridiculous. It's clear that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, but that was because of a preponderance of evidence over many, many years, even though an experiment wasn't done. So observational studies have their role, but technically cannot prove cause and effect.